You called the police because a black man checked his own mailbox. Officer Daniel Ramirez asked the question slowly, like even he couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth anymore. Rainwater rolled down the side of his patrol car in silver streaks while the red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street in restless flashes. The neighborhood of Willow Creek Estate sat under a cold October drizzle, every lawn trimmed perfectly, every porch glowing warm behind polished windows, but the tension hanging in the air tonight felt heavier than the storm clouds above. Karen Whitmore stood at the edge of her driveway wrapped in a cream-colored raincoat, arms folded tightly across her chest like she was guarding the entire neighborhood herself. Her short blonde hair barely moved in the wind, stiff with hairspray and pride. He was standing outside too long, she replied flatly. Watching houses. Officer Ramirez exhaled through his nose and glanced across the street. Elijah Brooks stood near the curb beneath the glow of a street lamp, one hand resting calmly on top of a black umbrella while the other held a folded piece of mail. Tall. Composed. Mid-40s maybe. The kind of man who carried himself with quiet patience instead of noise. Water dripped steadily from the edge of his coat onto the pavement, but he didn't move. Didn't argue. Didn't even look angry. Behind him, warm yellow light spilled from the front windows of his home where a small silhouette stood peeking through the curtains. Naomi. His 10-year-old daughter. Officer Ramirez recognized her immediately. She always waved when his patrol car passed through the neighborhood during school hours. Tonight she looked frightened instead. Ramirez said carefully, lowering his voice, "This is the 17th call in 4 months." Karen's jaw tightened. And maybe if someone listened the first time, we wouldn't keep having problems. A long silence settled over the street. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the dark sky. Elijah finally stepped forward, shoes splashing softly against the wet pavement. "Officer," he said calmly, "I checked my mailbox after dinner. That's all." His voice was steady, deep without sounding threatening, the kind of voice built from years of learning how not to escalate situations that shouldn't exist in the first place. Karen pointed immediately. "See? That tone right there." Ramirez blinked. "What tone?" She opened her mouth, then stopped. The officer rubbed one tired hand across his forehead. The dashboard clock inside his patrol car glowed 11:43 p.m. in pale blue digits. He'd already worked 11 hours. Domestic dispute near Route 9. Fender bender outside a gas station. Noise complaint from a college apartment. And now this. Again. Rain tapped softly against the roofs of parked cars while porch lights flickered across puddles lining the sidewalk. Elijah glanced once toward his daughter in the window. Naomi disappeared from the curtain a second later. He looked back at Ramirez. "I know you're just doing your job," he said quietly. "But my daughter has school tomorrow. I'd like her to sleep tonight without seeing police lights outside her house again." Something about the sentence seemed to land harder than Karen expected. Her expression shifted for half a second, almost uncertain, before pride pushed it away again. "Nobody told him to move into this neighborhood," she snapped. Elijah didn't answer. That was what unsettled Karen the most. He never answered the way she wanted him to. Never raised his voice. Never gave her the confrontation she seemed hungry for. The first week he moved into Willow Creek Estates, she called HOA because his moving truck stayed parked 30 minutes past regulation hours. 2 weeks later she reported suspicious activity because Elijah jogged through the neighborhood before sunrise. Then came complaints about music nobody else heard. Guests nobody else saw. Cars slowing down near his driveway. Packages arriving too late at night. 17 calls. 17 reports. 17 moments where Karen Whitmore expected the system to confirm what she already believed. Officer Ramirez looked toward Elijah again and noticed the small black notebook tucked beneath his arm. Same notebook he'd seen the last 3 visits. Rain dotted the leather cover. "You keeping records?" Ramirez asked. Quietly. Elijah nodded once. "Every interaction." Karen let out a sharp laugh. That's not creepy at all. But Ramirez noticed something else then. Elijah wasn't writing out of paranoia. He was documenting patterns. Dates. Times. Witnesses. Calmly. Methodically. Like someone assembling pieces of something larger than tonight. The officer's radio crackled softly on his shoulder. Somewhere nearby another dispatcher spoke through static, but Ramirez barely heard it. His attention stayed on Elijah Brooks, who stood beneath the rain without hostility, without fear, almost like he'd been expecting this exact moment to arrive eventually. Karen stepped closer toward the patrol car. "Officer, I don't feel safe." Ramirez looked at her for a long second. Then he glanced across the street at the little girl peeking from behind the curtains again, her small face glowing faintly beneath the hallway light. He looked back at Karen. "Honestly," he said quietly, "I'm starting to wonder who isn't safe here." The neighborhood fell silent except for the rain. The police lights finally disappeared around the corner just after midnight, leaving the wet street in darkness again except for the soft porch lamps glowing across Willow Creek Estates. Rain still clung to the sidewalks in silver patches while cold wind rattled the maple trees lining the neighborhood. Elijah Brooks stood alone at the edge of his driveway for several seconds after Officer Ramirez left, one hand still resting on the handle of his umbrella. The silence that followed always felt strange after moments like that. Like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath behind closed curtains. Across the street, Karen Whitmore remained standing near her front window. Even from this distance, Elijah could feel her watching. Not curious. Not ashamed. Watchful. Like she was guarding territory instead of sharing a community. He lowered his eyes and turned back toward his house. The front door opened before he even reached it. Naomi stood there barefoot in oversized purple socks, clutching a blanket tightly against her chest. The hallway light behind her painted a warm gold outline around her small frame. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. Elijah's expression softened immediately. "No, sweetheart." He stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him, shutting out the cold drizzle and the last traces of flashing lights. "You did absolutely nothing wrong." Naomi looked down at the floor. "Then why does she keep calling the police?" Elijah loosened his coat slowly and hung it near the doorway. Water dripped onto the welcome mat beneath his shoes. For a moment he did not answer. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he was trying to find the version of the truth a 10-year-old could carry without it becoming too heavy. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and laundry detergent. Quiet jazz played softly from a speaker in the kitchen, almost drowned out by the rain tapping the windows. Elijah finally crouched down to Naomi's level. "Sometimes people are afraid of things they do not understand," he said gently. Naomi frowned. "But she does not even know us." A small sadness passed through Elijah's eyes. "No," he replied softly. "Sometimes they do not need to." Naomi was quiet after that. She looked toward the front window where faint reflections from distant traffic lights shimmered against the glass. "I wish Mom was here," she whispered. Elijah felt something tighten deep in his chest, sudden and familiar. He nodded slowly. "Me too." He pulled her into a gentle hug, one hand resting against the back of her braided hair while the storm murmured softly outside. Upstairs, the old grandfather clock ticked steadily through the silence. After Naomi finally went to bed, Elijah sat alone at the kitchen table beneath a single hanging light. The black notebook rested open beside a steaming mug of untouched tea. Its pages were filled with neat handwriting, every incident carefully logged with dates, times, and details. September 3rd. Suspicious vehicle complaint. No violation found. September 18th. Noise complaint at 6:14 p.m. Television volume normal upon inspection. October 2nd. Loitering concern while retrieving trash bins. Elijah wrote slowly across a fresh page. October 21st. 11:43 p.m. Mailbox complaint. Officer. Ramirez responding. Naomi witnessed police interaction from front hallway window. He stopped writing for a moment and stared at the words. The ink reflected faintly beneath the kitchen light. Then he reached for his phone and attached another file to the digital folder already building quietly in the background. Video footage. Audio timestamps. Incident reports. Pattern documentation. Everything organized with calm precision. Outside, headlights passed briefly across the living room ceiling before disappearing again. Elijah leaned back in his chair and rubbed one tired hand across his jaw. Most people assumed calmness meant weakness. They mistook silence for surrender. But Elijah had spent nearly 20 years working inside courtrooms, depositions, and civil rights hearings. He knew something Karen Whitmore did not. Patterns mattered more than emotions. Systems revealed themselves eventually. And people who believed they were untouchable often became careless with repetition. A soft creak came from the staircase. Naomi stood halfway down in her pajamas holding a stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. "Dad." Elijah closed the notebook immediately. "You should be asleep." "I know." She hesitated. "Are we moving again?" The question landed heavier than anything Karen had said tonight. Elijah looked at his daughter carefully. New schools. New apartments. New neighborhoods. Too many fresh starts packed into one childhood already. He walked over and sat beside her on the stairs. "No," he said firmly this time. "We are staying." Naomi searched his face like she needed to make sure he believed it himself. "Promise?" Elijah nodded once. "Promise." She leaned against his shoulder quietly while rain slid down the windows beside them in slow, uneven trails. Somewhere across the street, Karen Whitmore turned off her porch light at exactly 12:14 a.m. Elijah noticed because he noticed everything now. Every complaint. Every look. Every moment. Not out of anger. Out of responsibility. Naomi yawned softly against his arm. "Why do you write everything down?" she murmured sleepily. Elijah looked toward the kitchen table where the black notebook still sat beneath the hanging light. His eyes lingered there for several long seconds before he answered. "Because patterns tell the truth," he said quietly. And upstairs, while the storm drifted slowly across Willow Creek Estates, Elijah Brooks kept listening to the silence between the raindrops, already knowing this story was heading somewhere bigger than a neighborhood dispute. By the following Monday morning, the storm had passed, but the tension inside Willow Creek Estate still lingered like moisture trapped beneath old wood. The sky stretched bright and pale above the neighborhood, washed clean after days of rain, while delivery trucks rolled slowly past rows of identical suburban homes with polished shutters and perfectly edged lawns. Children waited for school buses beneath maple trees dusted with orange leaves. Joggers moved through the sidewalks with wireless headphones and stainless steel water bottles. From a distance, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Controlled. Safe. That was exactly how Karen Whitmore liked it. At precisely 7:15 every morning, Karen opened the white plantation shutters in her kitchen and stood beside the coffee maker overlooking the street. She watched everything. The newspaper delivery times. Which neighbors left trash bins out too long. Which cars belonged in driveways and which ones did not. The routines mattered to her more than she would ever admit aloud. Control always did. Her late husband used to joke that Karen knew more about the neighborhood than the homeowners association itself. Back then people laughed about it. Back then it sounded harmless. But after Harold Whitmore passed away 3 years earlier, something inside Karen hardened into obsession. The quiet house became too large. Too empty. So she filled the silence with vigilance instead. Especially after Elijah Brooks moved in across the street with his daughter. Karen stared through the kitchen window now as Elijah loaded Naomi's purple backpack into the back seat of his dark blue SUV. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a pressed white shirt, sleeves rolled neatly at the wrists despite the cold morning air. Naomi climbed into the passenger side holding a science project board covered in glitter stars and handwritten notes. Elijah smiled at something she said before buckling her seatbelt carefully. Karen narrowed her eyes. Too polished, she thought. Too calm. Too careful. Men like him always made her uneasy because she could never read them the way she read everyone else. Most people revealed themselves eventually through frustration or ego. Elijah never did. He moved through the neighborhood with impossible patience. He waved at elderly neighbors carrying groceries. Helped fix Mrs. Keller's mailbox after a windstorm. Once he even spent nearly an hour helping a teenager change a flat tire near the subdivision entrance without asking for anything in return. Karen saw all of it from behind her windows. And somehow every act of kindness irritated her more. Because kindness complicated the narrative she had already built in her mind. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop. A neighborhood group chat notification lit the screen. Suspicious vehicle near Pinecrest Lane last night. Karen immediately typed back. Dark sedan parked near Brooks' residence around 11 p.m. Could be visitors. Stay alert, everyone. She hit send before taking a sip of coffee. Across the street, Elijah backed out of the driveway slowly and drove Naomi toward Willow Creek Elementary. Karen watched until the SUV disappeared around the corner. Then she opened another browser tab on her laptop. Willow Creek Homeowners Association Incident Archive. She scrolled carefully through months of filed complaints. Noise disturbances. Parking concerns. Landscaping violations. Security concerns. Nearly a quarter of them carried the same address now. 184, Willow Creek Drive. Elijah Brooks. Karen leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping lightly against the keyboard. A strange satisfaction settled over her chest whenever official records existed. Documentation made her feel protected. Validated. She convinced herself she was preserving standards. Maintaining order. But somewhere beneath all of it lived a fear she refused to name directly. The neighborhood was changing. Families looked different now. Languages sounded different at the grocery store. And every change felt to Karen like evidence that the world she understood was slipping beyond her control. That afternoon, sunlight poured warm and golden across the neighborhood as school buses rolled through Willow Creek Estates. Naomi sat on the front lawn drawing planets with sidewalk chalk while Elijah trimmed hedges near the porch. Soft instrumental music drifted from a speaker inside the house. Calm. Ordinary. Peaceful. Karen stood at her mailbox pretending to sort envelopes while secretly watching them again. Naomi laughed suddenly after accidentally smearing blue chalk across her hands. Elijah chuckled and handed her a towel from his back pocket. The sound floated across the street in the crisp autumn air. Karen's mouth tightened. Her gaze drifted toward the black notebook resting beside Elijah on the porch steps. Even from here she recognized it immediately. Always nearby. Always present. A record of something. She hated not knowing what. Elijah glanced up suddenly. Their eyes met across the street. Karen expected irritation. Maybe resentment. Instead, Elijah simply nodded politely once before returning to trimming the hedges. The calmness unsettled her more than anger ever could. Because deep down, Karen Whitmore was beginning to realize something she did not want to face. She had spent months trying to make Elijah Brooks look dangerous. Yet every encounter only seemed to reveal how controlled she herself had become by suspicion. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Willow Creek Estates while a cold breeze carried the scent of dry leaves through the quiet neighborhood. And behind her perfectly polished windows, Karen Whitmore kept watching the man across the street, never noticing that he had already begun quietly watching the pattern too. 3 nights later, the temperature dropped sharply across Willow Creek Estates, and by 9 p.m. the entire neighborhood had gone unusually quiet. Cold wind pushed brittle leaves across driveways while porch lights glowed pale against the dark. Inside the Brooks house, Naomi sat cross-legged on the living room rug finishing math homework while Elijah worked silently at the dining table beside his open laptop. Soft piano music drifted through the room beneath the steady hum of the heater. Outside, the sky carried the heavy stillness that always came before winter rain. Then suddenly everything went black. The music stopped first. Then the heater. Then the warm yellow lamps disappeared, swallowing the room in darkness. Naomi looked up immediately. "Dad." Elijah stood calmly from the table. "It is okay." Through the front window, the entire street had gone dark except for a few backup garden lights flickering dimly in neighboring yards. Somewhere down the block, a car alarm chirped once before falling silent again. Elijah reached into the kitchen drawer for a flashlight. Naomi hugged her blanket tighter. "Is the whole neighborhood out?" Before Elijah could answer, a sharp sound cut through the silence outside. Not a scream. More like frantic shouting carried by the wind. Elijah moved toward the front door and opened it carefully. Cold air rushed inside instantly. Across the street, Karen Whitmore stood near her front porch waving both arms toward her garage. "Help! Somebody help!" Her voice cracked with panic now, stripped completely of the polished control she usually carried. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. Another voice drifted weakly from inside the house. Male. Strained. He glanced back once toward Naomi. "Stay inside and lock the door behind me." Naomi looked nervous. "Is it Mrs. Whitmore?" Elijah nodded once. "I will be right back." The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he crossed the wet street quickly. Karen looked startled the moment she realized it was him approaching. For one awkward second, pride and panic battled visibly across her face. Panic 1. "It is Harold's oxygen machine," she said breathlessly. "The backup battery is not turning on." Elijah blinked once. "Your husband passed away." Karen's face tightened immediately. "My brother," she corrected sharply. "He moved in last month after surgery." Another weak cough echoed from somewhere inside the house. Elijah did not hesitate again. "Show me." The inside of Karen's home smelled faintly of lavender candles and old wood polish. Emergency lanterns cast pale shadows across the walls while upstairs a television beeped. Helplessly without power, Karen led Elijah quickly down a hallway toward a downstairs guest room where an older white man sat upright in bed wearing a nasal oxygen cannula. His breathing looked shallow. Beside him, the oxygen concentrator blinked uselessly beside a dead power strip. "The battery backup failed 20 minutes ago," Karen said quickly, voice shaking now. "I tried resetting it but nothing happened." Elijah crouched beside the machine immediately, flashlight balanced beneath one arm while his fingers moved carefully across the control panel. Calm. Efficient. Years ago, before law school and courtrooms and state investigations, Elijah had spent summers helping his uncle repair electrical systems in Baton Rouge. He still remembered more than most people expected. "The backup battery is connected wrong," he said quietly. "Did someone install this recently?" Karen nodded. "Yesterday." Elijah opened the battery compartment and adjusted 2 loose cables with steady hands. The room stayed silent except for the old man's breathing and the soft clicking of plastic switches. Then suddenly the machine hummed back to life. Warm airflow returned through the tubing immediately. The older man exhaled shakily in relief. Karen covered her mouth with one trembling hand. "Oh my God." Elijah stood slowly. He should still have paramedics check the unit tomorrow morning. "The battery is old." Karen stared at him for several long seconds beneath the dim lantern light. Her makeup had faded slightly around tired eyes that suddenly looked much older than before. Smaller too. Vulnerable in a way Elijah had never seen. "Thank you," she whispered quietly. The word sounded unfamiliar coming from her mouth. Elijah simply nodded once. "You are welcome." Another silence settled awkwardly between them. Outside, rain finally began tapping softly against the windows. Karen looked down briefly, almost embarrassed by her own dependence on the man she had spent months treating like a threat. "I did not know you could fix things like this." Elijah gave the faintest hint of a tired smile. There are a lot of things people do not know about their neighbors. Karen opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something more, but before the words came, flashing blue lights suddenly swept across the front windows again. Both of them froze. Karen's face drained instantly. Elijah turned slowly toward the living room as two police officers stepped onto the porch outside. A neighbor must have called about the shouting during the blackout. One officer knocked firmly against the front door. Karen looked at Elijah with visible panic now. For one strange moment she almost seemed afraid he would leave her there alone. But Elijah simply walked toward the door calmly and opened it before the officers could knock again. Officer Ramirez stood beneath the rain holding his flashlight. The moment he saw Elijah inside Karen Whitmore's house, his eyebrows lifted sharply. "Everything all right here?" he asked carefully. Karen stood frozen behind Elijah, unable to speak immediately. The oxygen machine hummed softly from down the hallway while rain streaked across the porch light outside. Elijah glanced back once toward Karen before answering in the same calm voice he always used. "Her family needed help," he said quietly. "So I came over." Officer Ramirez stood motionless on Karen Whitmore's porch while rainwater slid from the brim of his cap onto the wooden steps below. Behind him, another patrol car idled quietly near the curb, headlights glowing through the steady drizzle. For a few seconds nobody spoke. The oxygen machine hummed softly somewhere down the hallway while Karen stood near the staircase clutching both arms tightly against herself like she had suddenly become cold inside her own home. Ramirez looked from Elijah to Karen and back again, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. 3 nights ago Karen had accused Elijah of lurking outside his own property. Tonight he was standing inside her living room helping save a member of her family during a blackout. The contradiction hung in the air heavier than the storm outside. "We received a disturbance call from another resident," Ramirez finally said carefully. "Reports of yelling." Karen opened her mouth immediately. "Everything is fine." The sentence came too fast, too sharp, almost defensive. Ramirez blinked once. He had never heard her sound nervous before. Elijah stepped slightly aside from the doorway. "Her brother's medical equipment lost power during the outage," he explained calmly. "The battery connection failed." Ramirez glanced toward the hallway where the older man now sat resting quietly against pillows beneath dim lantern light. The officer nodded slowly. "Understood." Rain tapped steadily against the porch roof while cold wind pushed leaves across the driveway outside. Karen avoided Elijah's eyes completely now. Something about receiving help from the very man she had spent months reporting to the police seemed to unsettle her in ways she could not hide anymore. Ramirez noticed it too. "Well," he said carefully, "looks like the emergency is handled." But before the moment could settle, another voice suddenly called from across the street. "Officer!" Everyone turned. Mrs. Donna Keller stood beneath an umbrella near her mailbox wearing a heavy cardigan and rain boots. Her silver hair whipped slightly in the wind as she stepped carefully through puddles toward the Whitmore house. "I think somebody should know what is really going on around here." Karen's face tightened instantly. "Donna, this is not your business." "Actually," Mrs. Keller replied firmly, "it became everybody's business around the 5th police visit." Ramirez exhaled quietly beneath his breath. Elijah remained still beside the doorway, expression unreadable. Mrs. Keller stopped near the porch steps and looked directly at the officer. "That man has done nothing but help people since he moved here," she said, pointing toward Elijah. "He fixed my mailbox after the storm. He carried groceries for Frank Nelson after his knee surgery. And tonight he crossed the street to help somebody who has spent months trying to humiliate him." Karen's cheeks flushed red immediately. "That is not what I was doing." "Then what were you doing?" Mrs. Keller asked softly. The question landed harder than shouting ever could. Karen looked around suddenly as porch lights flicked on across neighboring homes. Curtains shifted. Shadows moved behind windows. People were watching now. Not just Elijah this time. Her. The realization clearly rattled her. Ramirez shifted uncomfortably. He had worked this neighborhood for nearly 8 years. Quiet streets. Property disputes. Teenagers sneaking beer into parks. But lately every dispatch involving Willow Creek Estate seemed to circle back to one address and one woman's suspicions. And standing here tonight, watching Elijah remain composed while the neighborhood slowly realized the pattern themselves, the officer felt something changing beneath the surface of all this. Karen straightened defensively. I was protecting my neighborhood. Elijah finally spoke again, his voice calm enough to cut straight through the rain. From what exactly? Karen looked at him sharply but found no anger in his face. Only exhaustion. That somehow made it worse. You would not understand, she muttered quietly. Try me. Another silence spread across the porch. Somewhere nearby thunder rolled softly in the distance while rain shimmered beneath the police lights parked along the curb. Karen's breathing looked uneven now. Cornered not by aggression, but by the weight of her own accusations finally being spoken aloud in front of other people. Everything changed after families like yours started moving in, she admitted before she could stop herself. The moment the words left her mouth, the entire porch seemed to freeze. Even the rain suddenly sounded louder. Mrs. Keller closed her eyes briefly in disappointment. Officer Ramirez looked down toward the wet wooden steps beneath his boots. Elijah stood completely still. Naomi had quietly stepped onto her own front porch across the street now, blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she watched through the rain from beneath the porch light. Karen noticed her a second too late. The child's face fell slowly as understanding settled into her expression. Elijah followed Karen's gaze toward his daughter. Something flickered behind his eyes then. Not rage. Not shock. Just a deep tired sadness that looked far older than this neighborhood. He walked slowly down the porch steps into the rain without another word. Karen suddenly looked panicked. I did not mean, but Elijah kept walking across the street. Toward Naomi beneath the flashing reflections of police lights on wet pavement. Ramirez watched him carefully. The man never raised his voice. Never threatened anybody. Never gave the neighborhood the version of him they kept trying to provoke into existence. And somehow that quiet dignity now exposed everything uglier around him with painful clarity. Naomi looked up at her father as he reached the porch. Dad, she whispered softly. Elijah crouched slightly beside her, rain soaking through the shoulders of his coat. Go inside, sweetheart. Naomi hesitated. Did we do something bad again? Elijah swallowed once before answering. No, he said quietly. Some people just have storms inside them that rain cannot wash away. Across the street, Karen Whitmore stood frozen beneath the porch light while the entire neighborhood watched the silence she had finally created. The rain finally stopped sometime after 2 in the morning, leaving Willow Creek Estate wrapped in a strange silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. Water clung to tree branches and mailbox posts in tiny silver drops that reflected the dim streetlights like scattered glass. Inside the Brooks house, the living room lamp cast a soft amber glow across the hardwood floor while Naomi slept curled beneath a blanket on the couch instead of upstairs in her bedroom. Elijah sat nearby in the armchair facing the dark front window, still wearing the same charcoal coat from earlier, now dried stiff from the rain. The black notebook rested closed on the coffee table beside him. He had not opened it since coming home. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful again. Perfect lawns. Quiet houses. No flashing lights. No voices. But Elijah knew better than most people that silence did not always mean peace. Sometimes it only meant people had stopped saying the ugly parts out loud. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the room while faint headlights occasionally drifted across the ceiling from distant traffic beyond the subdivision entrance. Elijah leaned forward slowly, elbows resting against his knees, eyes fixed on the reflection in the dark glass ahead of him. He looked tired now. In a way he rarely allowed himself to show. Not physically. Soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from constantly measuring your voice, your posture, your reactions, because one wrong expression could suddenly become confirmation of someone else's fear. He understood that game too well. He had spent half his life learning how to survive inside rooms where people decided who belonged before introductions even began. Courtrooms. Neighborhoods. Schools. Country clubs. Board meetings. It changed shape depending on the setting, but the feeling stayed the same. Naomi shifted slightly beneath the blanket and opened sleepy eyes. "Dad." Elijah immediately softened his expression. "You should still be asleep." She pushed herself upright slowly. "I had a bad dream." Elijah nodded once and reached for the folded blanket near the armrest, placing it gently around her shoulders. "Do you want some tea?" Naomi shook her head. Her small fingers played nervously with the edge of the blanket while she stared toward the dark window too. Did Mrs. Whitmore mean what she said? The question hung quietly in the room between them. Elijah looked down for several long seconds before answering. "Yes," he said honestly. Naomi swallowed. "Because we are black." Elijah leaned back slowly in the chair. The soft lamp beside him painted warm gold against the tired lines beneath his eyes. He could have lied. Could have softened it into something easier. But children always knew when adults were hiding pain from them. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "people decide who you are before they ever learn your name." Naomi's face tightened slightly. "That is not fair." Elijah gave a faint smile without humor. "No. It is not." Another silence settled over the room. Outside, cold wind brushed softly through wet trees while somewhere down the street a wind chime rattled gently in the dark. Naomi looked toward the notebook on the coffee table. "Is that why you write everything down?" Elijah followed her gaze. The black leather cover reflected softly beneath the lamp. "Partly." Naomi frowned. "I do not understand." Elijah reached for the notebook slowly and rested one hand against it. "When people are afraid," he said carefully, "they stop seeing moments clearly. They only see feelings. But patterns," he paused briefly. "Patterns tell the truth even when people do not want to hear it." Naomi listened quietly while curled beneath the blanket. "Are you going to get Mrs. Whitmore in trouble?" Elijah looked toward the window again where rain still shimmered across the street beneath pale moonlight. Across from them, Karen Whitmore's porch light remained on even at this hour. He could faintly see movement behind her curtains. Restless pacing maybe. Sleeplessness had a way of exposing people to themselves. "No," Elijah answered softly. "I am trying to stop trouble before it grows into something bigger." Naomi leaned against his arm carefully. "She does not seem scared of getting in trouble." Elijah stared out toward the empty street for a long moment before speaking again. "People who live inside fear long enough stop recognizing it," he said quietly. "They start calling it protection instead." Naomi grew silent after that. The clock continued ticking softly while warm light stretched across the quiet living room floor. For the first time since moving to Willow Creek Estates, Elijah allowed himself to close his eyes briefly. Not in peace. Just in stillness. The kind that comes after carrying tension for too many months straight. Somewhere deep down, he already knew tonight had changed something irreversible. Not because Karen had finally said the quiet part aloud. But because other people had heard it too. Officer Ramirez. Mrs. Keller. The neighbors watching through half-open curtains. The illusion had cracked. And once people saw the pattern clearly, they could not pretend anymore that each incident stood alone. Naomi's breathing slowed again as sleep gradually returned. Elijah pulled the blanket gently higher around her shoulders. Then he looked once more toward the glowing porch light across the street. Karen Whitmore was still awake too. Two houses facing each other through the darkness. One carrying fear. The other carrying restraint. And somewhere between them, the truth was finally beginning to surface in the silence. The following Thursday began colder than usual, with thin frost clinging to rooftops and lawns across Willow Creek Estates like a pale layer of dust. The sky hung low and grey above the neighborhood while parents hurried children toward school buses with steaming coffee cups in their hands. But by 8:30 that morning, something unusual had already spread quietly through the subdivision. 2 black government SUVs sat parked outside Elijah Brooks's house. Not police vehicles. Cleaner. Darker. Official in a different way. Curtains shifted all along the street. Front doors cracked open slightly despite the cold. Karen Whitmore noticed the vehicles the moment she pulled apart her bedroom blinds upstairs. Her stomach tightened instantly. 2 men in long charcoal coats stepped out carrying leather folders while a woman wearing a navy overcoat followed behind them. They moved with calm precision, not urgency. Professionals. Karen watched Elijah open his front door wearing a tailored dark suit and silver tie instead of his usual neighborhood clothes. Naomi stood beside him holding a lunchbox decorated with planets and stars. One of the men smiled warmly at Naomi before handing Elijah a thick folder. Karen narrowed her eyes. She could not hear the conversation from across the street, but she noticed something that unsettled her immediately. Respect. The people outside Elijah's house were speaking to him with visible respect. Not politeness. Deference. Karen stepped downstairs quickly, still wearing slippers against the hardwood floor. By the time she reached the kitchen window, the black SUVs remained parked outside while Elijah signed several documents beside the driveway. Naomi climbed into the back seat of one vehicle while the woman in the navy coat held the door open for her like security detail. Karen's pulse quickened slightly. "What exactly are you?" she whispered under her breath. Across the street, Elijah suddenly looked up from the papers. Their eyes met briefly through the cold morning air. Unlike before, he did not nod politely this time. He simply held her gaze for one long unreadable second before returning calmly to the conversation. Karen stepped back from the window immediately. An hour later, Willow Creek Estates buzzed quietly with speculation. Mrs. Keller heard from another neighbor that the vehicles carried state government plates. Somebody else claimed they saw armed security personnel. By lunchtime, the neighborhood social media page had exploded with theories. Federal prosecutor. Judge. Politician. Corporate investigator. Karen read every comment alone at her kitchen table, fingers tightening around a mug of untouched coffee. Then her phone rang. Karen. The voice belonged to Officer Ramirez. Her chest tightened immediately. "What happened?" she asked. Ramirez paused briefly on the other end. "I actually needed to ask you something." Karen straightened in her chair. "About what?" Another silence. "Do you know who your neighbor is?" Karen frowned. "Elijah Brooks." "No," Ramirez said carefully. "I mean professionally." Karen's mouth went dry. "Why?" Ramirez exhaled quietly. "Because this morning I received a departmental memo advising officers to direct all future concerns involving Mr. Brooks through the State Civil Rights Division before escalation." Karen stared at the kitchen wall without blinking. "What does that mean?" "It means," Ramirez said slowly, "your neighbor is not just some guy keeping records." He paused again. "Karen. Elijah Brooks is the state attorney overseeing hate-based harassment and civil rights enforcement for the entire district." Silence flooded the room instantly. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. Outside the kitchen window, cold wind moved softly through bare tree branches while distant sunlight reflected against the black SUVs parked across the street. "No," she whispered automatically. "That cannot be right." "It is." Ramirez's voice remained calm but firm now. "And from what I understand, every incident involving those police calls has already been documented." Karen's breathing became uneven. She looked instinctively toward the drawer where she kept printed HOA complaints and handwritten notes about Elijah's activities. Suddenly all of it no longer felt organized or protective. It felt dangerous. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood," she said weakly. Ramirez did not answer immediately. "When?" He finally spoke again, his tone sounded tired more than angry. From what, Karen? The same question Elijah had asked days earlier now echoed through her kitchen again, only this time there was no confidence left inside her to avoid it. Her eyes drifted toward the window across the street. Elijah stood beside one of the SUVs speaking quietly with the woman in the navy coat while Naomi laughed at something one of the agents said beside the vehicle. For the first time since he moved into Willow Creek Estates, Karen saw the full picture clearly. The calmness. The restraint. The notebook. The patience during every police visit. Elijah Brooks had known exactly how serious this pattern was from the beginning. And still he never humiliated her publicly. Never threatened her. Never used his power to crush her. That realization landed harder than fear itself. Ramirez's voice broke the silence softly. There is one more thing you should know. Karen swallowed. What? He never filed charges. She blinked rapidly. What? The department reviewed the incidents after last week, Ramirez explained. Technically there were grounds for filing harassment claims months ago. But Mr. Brooks declined. Karen stared at the rain-stained street outside her window while something inside her slowly collapsed under the weight of that sentence. Across the road, Elijah opened the SUV door for Naomi before climbing inside beside her. The vehicles pulled away quietly moments later, tires rolling slowly across the cold pavement beneath pale winter sunlight. Karen remained frozen by the kitchen window long after they disappeared around the corner. Because suddenly the thing that haunted her most was not that her neighbor held power. It was that he had every reason to use it against her, and chose dignity instead. By Friday evening, winter rain had returned to Willow Creek Estates in soft gray waves that blurred porch lights and street signs beneath a cold mist. The neighborhood felt different now. Quieter. Not because people had stopped watching, but because they had started thinking. Curtains still shifted when Elijah Brooks pulled into his driveway after work, but the looks carried uncertainty now instead of suspicion. Rumors had spread too far to ignore. State Attorney. Civil Rights Division. Harassment investigations. Suddenly every uncomfortable moment from the past few months had taken on a different shape inside people's minds. Karen Whitmore felt it most of all. She had barely slept since Officer Ramirez's phone call. Every creak inside her house sounded louder now. Every memory replayed differently. The police lights outside Elijah's home. The complaints. The reports. Naomi standing frightened beneath the porch light. Worst of all was the realization that Elijah had understood exactly what was happening long before anybody else did. And still he never embarrassed her publicly. That mercy haunted her more than punishment would have. Rain slid slowly down Karen's kitchen windows while untouched soup cooled beside her on the counter. Across the street, warm light glowed softly inside the Brooks home. She could see Naomi moving through the living room carrying what looked like school art supplies while Elijah worked quietly at the dining table. Normal. Peaceful. The same thing she had spent months disrupting. Karen lowered herself slowly into a chair and covered her eyes with one trembling hand. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to ask a question she had spent her entire life avoiding. What if the danger was never them? A soft knock interrupted the silence. Karen looked up immediately. Another knock came through the front door, gentle this time. She stood slowly and walked across the dark hallway, rain tapping steadily against the roof overhead. When she opened the door, Mrs. Donna Keller stood outside holding a foil-covered casserole dish beneath an umbrella. "You look terrible," Mrs. Keller said honestly. Karen almost laughed despite herself. "Thank you." Mrs. Keller stepped inside without waiting for permission, setting the dish carefully onto the kitchen counter. The older woman glanced toward the rain-streaked windows before speaking again. "You know the whole neighborhood is talking." Karen stared down at the floor. "I know." "And?" Karen swallowed hard. "And they are right." The admission came out barely above a whisper. Mrs. Keller studied her quietly for a long moment. "Do you understand why?" Karen looked toward the glowing house across the street. I thought Her voice cracked slightly. "I thought I was protecting what this neighborhood used to be." Mrs. Keller sighed softly. "Karen, neighborhoods are supposed to grow. That is what living means." Rain rattled gently against the windows while warm kitchen light stretched across the floor between them. Karen's eyes looked exhausted now, stripped of the sharp certainty she had worn for months. "I never thought of myself as racist," she admitted quietly. Mrs. Keller pulled out a chair and sat slowly at the table. "Most people who are never do." The word settled heavily into the room. Across the street, Naomi suddenly opened the front door carrying a small trash bag toward the curb. Karen watched the little girl carefully through the rain. Naomi hesitated briefly after spotting Karen standing at the window. For one awkward second both of them froze beneath the glow of opposite porch lights. Then Naomi lowered her eyes quickly and hurried back inside. Karen's chest tightened painfully. "She is afraid of me," she whispered. Mrs. Keller did not answer because there was nothing left to soften. Karen leaned both hands against the kitchen counter as emotion slowly overtook her composure. "I never wanted to hurt anybody." "Intentions matter," Mrs. Keller said gently. "But impact matters too." Another long silence passed between them. Finally Karen straightened slightly and looked toward the coat hanging beside the front door. "I need to talk to him." Mrs. Keller raised an eyebrow. "Tonight?" Karen nodded slowly. "If I wait any longer, I might lose the nerve." The rain had softened to a cold drizzle by the time Karen crossed the street 20 minutes later. Her hands trembled inside her coat pockets while wet leaves stuck against the sidewalk beneath her shoes. The Brooks house looked warm through the front windows. Jazz music drifted faintly through the rain along with the soft sound of Naomi laughing at something inside. Karen stopped halfway up the walkway, suddenly unsure whether she even deserved to knock. Before she could decide, the front door opened gently. Elijah stood there wearing a dark sweater with reading glasses resting low on his nose. He looked surprised to see her, but not hostile. Somehow that made this harder. Rainwater slid quietly from the porch roof around them while warm yellow light spilled onto the wet steps. Karen opened her mouth twice before words finally came. "I owe you an apology." Elijah remained still, waiting. Karen looked down at her shaking hands. "Not because of your position," she said quietly. "And not because people found out who you are." Her eyes finally lifted toward his. "Because I stopped seeing you as a person long before any of this started." The rain whispered softly around the porch while silence stretched between them. Elijah studied her carefully, exhaustion visible behind his calm expression. Then he glanced briefly back toward the living room where Naomi sat coloring at the coffee table beneath warm light. When he looked at Karen again, his voice remained gentle but painfully honest. "Do you know what hurt most?" Karen swallowed. "What?" Elijah answered quietly. "My daughter started believing police cars outside our house were normal." The words landed harder than anger ever could. Karen's eyes filled immediately. She lowered her head as cold rain gathered along the edge of the porch between them. And for the first time since Elijah Brooks moved into Willow Creek Estates, Karen Whitmore finally stood face to face not with her fear, but with the damage it had created. Winter settled fully over Willow Creek Estates by early December, covering rooftops in thin sheets of frost that shimmered pale blue beneath the morning sun. The trees lining the sidewalk stood nearly bare now, their branches rattling softly whenever cold wind drifted through the neighborhood. Christmas wreaths appeared on front doors. Porch lights glowed warmer against the longer nights. And little by little, something inside the subdivision began changing too. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just quietly. The way healing usually happens. The police cars stopped coming first. Weeks passed without flashing lights reflecting across the Brooks family windows. Then the neighborhood group chat changed tone. Suspicious person posts disappeared. Complaints slowed. Conversations became ordinary again. School fundraisers. Holiday decorations. Lost pets. Everyday things. Karen Whitmore noticed all of it from behind her kitchen window each morning while sipping coffee in silence. But the biggest change was harder to explain. The street no longer felt divided in half. It simply felt like a neighborhood again. Across from her house, Naomi Brooks rode her bicycle slowly along the sidewalk wearing a bright red scarf that bounced behind her in the cold air. Some afternoons she laughed with children from neighboring homes near the cul-de-sac while parents watched from folding lawn chairs wrapped in blankets. Nobody stared anymore when Elijah walked through the neighborhood after work. People waved now. Sometimes they even stopped to talk. Mrs. Keller still brought over baked casseroles twice a month whether anyone asked or not. Officer Ramirez occasionally parked near the entrance during lunch breaks just to drink coffee and chat with residents. The tension that once wrapped around the street had loosened at last. Yet Karen still carried the weight of it privately. She had started attending mandatory community mediation sessions 3 weeks earlier through a local outreach program Elijah quietly recommended instead of filing formal complaints. At first she hated every minute of it. Sitting inside fluorescent-lit rooms discussing bias and fear with strangers felt humiliating. But slowly the defensiveness inside her began cracking open. One uncomfortable truth at a time. She started recognizing how often fear disguised itself as order in her life. How easily suspicion became habit. How loneliness had sharpened her need to control things she never truly understood. None of it excused what she had done. But understanding it finally gave her somewhere honest to begin changing. One Saturday afternoon, snow began falling lightly across Willow Creek Estates for the first time that season. Small flakes drifted lazily through pale sunlight while children ran outside bundled in oversized coats and gloves. Karen stood near her living room window watching the neighborhood quietly. Across the street, Naomi knelt near the sidewalk drawing shapes in fresh snow with a mitten-covered hand while Elijah carried grocery bags from the SUV toward the house. The scene looked peaceful enough to hurt. Karen glanced toward the hallway closet where a small cardboard box sat waiting beside the door. She had bought it 3 days earlier and nearly talked herself out of it for separate times. But today she finally picked it up. Outside, cold air bit sharply against her face as she crossed the street slowly through thin snow. Naomi looked up first. Her expression tightened slightly with uncertainty the moment she recognized Karen approaching. Elijah noticed too. He straightened carefully beside the front porch but did not move toward them. Karen stopped several feet away from Naomi, snowflakes collecting against the shoulders of her dark coat. For a second she forgot every sentence she practiced in her head. Then she simply held out the cardboard box quietly. Naomi looked toward her father instinctively. Elijah gave a small nod. Naomi stepped forward cautiously and opened the box. Inside sat a brand new set of sidewalk chalk in every color imaginable. Bright blues, reds, greens, golds. Tiny snowflakes landed softly across the plastic packaging while Naomi stared down at it silently. Karen swallowed hard. "I remembered you liked drawing," she said quietly. Naomi looked up slowly. There was still uncertainty in her eyes, but something gentler too now. "Thank you," she whispered. Karen nodded once, unable to trust her own voice anymore. She turned slightly toward Elijah then. Snow drifted softly between them while pale winter sunlight reflected against the quiet street. "I know saying sorry does not erase what happened," she said carefully. Elijah studied her for a long moment before answering. "No," he said softly. "It does not." Karen lowered her eyes briefly. Then Elijah continued. "But teaching someone to fear people who look different from them does not have to be permanent either." Karen looked back up slowly. No anger. No triumph. Just truth. That same calm truth he carried from the beginning. Naomi pulled a blue chalk stick from the box and hesitated awkwardly before holding it out toward Karen. "Do you want to help me draw the stars?" The question seemed to catch Karen completely off guard. Her eyes widened slightly beneath falling snow. Then slowly, almost carefully, she accepted the chalk from Naomi's mitten-covered hand. Together they knelt near the sidewalk while soft snow continued drifting across Willow Creek Estates. Elijah stood quietly on the porch watching them beneath the pale winter sky. No speeches. No dramatic forgiveness. Just a little girl drawing stars in the snow beside the woman who once feared her family without knowing them at all. Across the street, porch lights flickered on one by one as evening approached, glowing warm against the cold blue dusk. And for the first time since Elijah Brooks moved into the neighborhood, the silence settling over Willow Creek Estates no longer sounded like suspicion. It sounded like peace.